Great. So we'll kick things off. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is a highly requested webinar. We've had a number of you, of our members in UK Homes Network reaching out. We've had Ben and Louise on the webinars before. It got an amazing reaction. So we've brought them back by popular demand to share even more insights around utilities and connecting services on land. I'm going to just quickly run through some housekeeping to get us all kicked off, and then I'm going to hand over to Louise and Ben, and we're going to dive straight into the topic at hand. So thanks for joining. If you have never joined us before, or this is your first time, please do put who you are, what you do, and where in the country you are into the chat. The chat's now open on the right-hand side of your screen. It's also a live Q&A, so please get involved, share your questions with Ben and Louise. We'll get plenty of time at the end to run through all those. So if there's something specific you want to talk about, or there's a specific point you want to raise, please do put them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. We also have another webinar coming up next Friday. So the webinar is on leveraging social media within the property industry. We aren't going to have a guest on that one. I'm going to do that one solo, which could be quite interesting. So I'm going to run you through basically how you can leverage social media to promote your personal brand, to find more deals, but generally just attract more business online. And we'll also take a look at UK Homes Network as well. So quick introduction from me. My name's Chris. I'm the co-founder of UK Homes Network. I set up the business in late January of this year with my brother David. I've been in property for about 14 years. Much of that time I worked as an estate agent, and then more recently in house building and property finance. And that's where I got the idea for UK Homes Network. So UK Homes Network is the UK's first social media platform exclusively for the property industry. So it's a way you guys can connect with each other, talk about what's happening, raise discussion points, ask for recommendations, or generally just promote your business to a verified network of property professionals. Ben is already in UK Homes Network and uses it quite regularly. So if you want to ask any questions to Ben that you don't manage to get round to on the webinar, then please do in UK Homes Network. It would be great to see you in there. And particularly if there's any discussion topics that you want to take away from today and post it into the network, we'd love to hear from you. So you can use the QR code on screen. And later on in the webinar, I will send you a link where you can download the app, or if you want to sign up to the web-based version, you can do. So that's all it from my slides and a bit of housekeeping. I'm going to hand you over to our two amazing guests. So Ben, Louise, how are you?
Very good. Thanks very much, Chris. Very good indeed.
Yeah, I'm
Louise?
good. It's a Friday. It's a good day.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So should we kick off with a bit of an introduction for ourselves as well? And that'll kind of tee things up nicely.
Yeah, Ben, introduce yourself. Let everyone know who you are and what your background is.
Yeah, so my name is Ben Tibbetts. So I've been in the property industry a little bit longer than Chris, despite obviously looking quite a lot younger and more handsome than he is. It's been about 25 years now that I've been in the industry. I've worked in various different guises in the past. So I'm a chartered surveyor by background and by qualification. I've worked for DCZ now, called Cushman's. I've worked for Knight Frank. And then I've also worked for Taylor Wimpey, which used to be George Wimpey, as a sort of a land buyer as well. I then sort of moved into the weird and wonderful world of wayleaves and easements and sort of everything energy and infrastructure. And I sort of ran a business there for about 5 years before setting up myself. Almost 10 years. It'll be 10-year anniversary next year, so I'm quite excited about that. Yeah, for the last sort of 10 years, really been sort of specialising in very much the sort of new connections, but also in existing utility constraints and infrastructure on development as well. So without further ado, I think I'll hand over to Louise.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Louise Sutton. I'm Managing Director over at BTS. I have been with BTS, I think it's nearly 8-9 years. Prior to that, I was at CBRE for most of my property career. I started as a graduate, having done the real estate management course. Started as a graduate and then went round on the rotation, but actually finally settled in investment valuation and used to do a lot of the valuations for the pension funds. And I also did quite a bit on the development side and residual valuations for the banks in terms of loan security. Yeah, that's probably a bit about me. 10 years, I was at CBRE for 11 years in between children. Decided to have a break for 3 months and then started with Ben. So yeah, so I think I've been in property for about 20 years in total.
Great.
Louise, yeah, Louise is very much the driving force of BTS, and as we found, lots of things that we've now gone into in terms of things like battery storage, so the new connections, and just dealing with all nasty and difficult constraints that developers often come across. Most of the time too late, but we're trying to help them try and find that out a little bit earlier. Chris, I was going to sort of share a couple of things. I mean, I'm not quite as organised as you with all your lovely fancy slides, but I think you were just saying as well, very happy for people to sort of chip in at any time. I don't think we're going to take a completely structured view on this, and I think anyone who's joined the UKM's network, we're a real proud supporter, and actually been with Chris now for a good year, almost from inception when. We were caught sort of hugging or maybe cradling, or I don't know, trying to keep each other warm in a Land-Aid sleep out. So some people may have already heard that story before, but it was great. We bonded, not necessarily the way we were expecting to, but then since then, actually, it's been really supportive of us and very supportive of the property industry as a whole. And we've really loved posting in that network and actually having a real dedicated property network that's benefited us and obviously benefiting all individuals, especially SMEs, and really helping them drive to be our future house builders and future developers of this country. So. Yeah, so is it worth me just kicking off, Chris, unless there's anything else?
Yeah, fire into it, Ben. Yeah.
Fine, great. Okay. So the first one I just wanted to do was more out of interest than anything else for everybody, hopefully. We're talking obviously about new connections today, but I almost want to try and give a tiny bit of a background to things and why we believe this sort of new connections are very important, and also the approach that perhaps you sort of take to them. So this is really just picking up from the NESO, who effectively is the system operator. They're kind of managing and looking at all our energy sort of usage across the UK and actually giving sort of advice back to sort of government, and really just trying to, keeping a bit of an assessment, to keep a bit of a feel for it for us all. So, simple, quite a starting basis, how was our electricity generated? As you can see, still here, a lot of our electricity is still generated by gas, about 29%. Most of that's picking up from a lot of cost Norwegian, and also from importing a lot of gas across from that side and across the countries. What's been great is the increase in wind. I mean, that's been a huge mandate, and it's been for all sort of governments of really trying to release that and try and release the offshore wind generation. Obviously, you see a bit of nuclear, biomass, coal, which is zero, which is fantastic. That's gone down, and we haven't had to dip back into there in terms of the generation and power side things. Quite a lot of solar electric, which is good, but it can be sort of a bit intermittent. I think what the real driver is clearly on wind, as you can see that very simple graph there. Looking at offset imports there, bits of hydro and storage. And storage has become a big one, a big increase as well. You're looking at all those arrows, you can see what's come down and what's gone up. So, very much up in storage. Up on wind, okay, yes, there's a bit of up on gas, but we're trying to head in that flexible power that we're trying to work towards. So there we go. So in terms of where a lot of gas comes from, it's still, a lot of Norwegian sort of gas fields, and obviously sort of on the very much sort of centralised Scotland, all across our coastlines as well. Get quite a lot of imports still. And we're obviously using a huge amount, domestically, and also commercially as well in terms of gas for heating a lot of our networks at the moment. I'm not really going to talk too much about this, but it's just really where things are going from a zero carbon sort of perspective. The mandate from government is by 2050, which I think we're all familiar with, trying to get down to zero carbon. and things have been sort of moving and are trying to move in the right direction. You know, it requires a lot of investment, but we are hopefully going that sort of in the right direction on it. Next thing I'm just going to just quickly flick on to really, and it's a sort of headline, and it's actually for, you know, all people thinking about development. A lot of people may be familiar with this or not. It's the Future Building Standard. Now, this Future Building Standards, I literally just flicked straight into the government website for this. Is you'll see here, this was published, you know, during the 22 Conservative sort of government. And this brought in a few sort of regulations. It brought in a lot of what people will understand and hear about in terms of Part L, which is the building regulations. Part L is where the real driving force is in terms of making sure our homes are more efficient, and also becomes the regulation by which they have to be as well. So Part L does apply to sort of existing buildings, but I think there's a lot of rhetoric all about this Future Home Standard, which is for new homes and what that sort of impacts. So 2025 is when this really comes in. A lot of our big sort of house builders are talking about this, and understanding that what they're going to have to produce is some serious differences and efficiencies in the building they do. Now, I'm going to stop the sort of share there for now. And what this is creating a bit of a bottleneck. So I'm going to start off with some things and why, you know, you've got to really concentrate on new connections, and then some of the good things that are future and why this is driving something that's really good going forward. So from our perspective, what we're seeing is that this bottleneck of where a lot of new homes that are being built to what will be the 2025 no new gas boilers. So no new gas boilers or no connections to gas for new homes in 2025. So all house builders and all SMEs house builders are realising that if they want to sell those properties and, you know, understand the planning system, how long it takes, understanding how delivery sort of takes, then they're having to move to that to future-proof effectively their development for those sales in 25, which is clearly not very far away. So with that, that's creating a bit of a bottleneck in terms of the timing of delivery for things like electricity. There's a huge uplift and uptake of people now saying, well, we're having to heat our homes via electricity as well now. No longer on the sort of gas. And obviously all the cookers and everything else as well now all being connected to electric. So there's a big surge in demand, which has created difficulties for the electricity industry. And with it, you know, there's a lot of applications going in. There's a lot of confusion around it. There's also I'm trying to understand the reinforcement that then's required for your development. Now, your development only might be 5-10 units, but actually, even at those sort of sizes, if the network is already at capacity in your local area, some reinforcement will be required at the local sort of substation, effectively, the distribution area of it. And with that creates time and potentially sort of cost. Along with this is everyone's now sort of moving towards this sort of Future Home Standard, and these Part L regulations, and we have EPC ratings that are knocking around in the background. At the moment, we're sort of minimum E. EPCs, they want them by, I think it's C, by about 2030. So again, people are sort of thinking that, and also again, future-proofing, and that helps the value of a home as well. So clearly, when you're looking to do these things, your new connections, and the idea of things is actually do think about that. You know, that those values and what people are buying into now with the utility bills going up the way that they've gone is really, really important sort of factor. So in terms of where you sort of perhaps maybe start on this is that, you know, I've talked a bit about how we really need to kind of get into sort of the nuts and bolts of what you might be looking as a new connection. And Louise will sort of jump in, and if I'm sort of going a bit off track on this, and please do sort of fire some of your questions. The first thing that we find, and very much as BTS, is do your due diligence. You know, maybe you've just stuck an offer on a piece of land or something, or maybe you're thinking of putting an offer on a piece of land. That doesn't stop you or prevent you from starting to get some of these maybe budget applications in to some of the electricity companies, some of the water companies, just to try and find out what that cost could be. And I think it's really important, especially when you know you're going to be so reliant on this in terms of your new development. The first thing that we tend to do And I'm just going to pull up another website, and some of you may be familiar with this. It's called Line Search Before You Dig. Now, what Line Search Before You Dig does, and I've just literally hopefully shared that and everyone can see that, it's a free service for people to use. And in there, what Line Search Dig is Line Search Dig pulls together, it's got a whole load of members here, but it's effectively a lot of a national database of a lot of the pipelines, utility services across the UK, where they are, and all the operators that are kind of involved in that area. Now, they don't have to have every single person covered across the country, so please bear that in mind. This isn't just the only place to go, but it does talk about, when you get your results back, which are their members, which aren't their members. But what you do get back from that is you get all the right points of contact, and you get things like asset plans. So, for example, if you go to Line Search Before You Dig, it will throw you back and spit you back some inquiries. Some are all automated, and you'll actually get some of the service records and plans from an operator, from an electricity company, from a gas company, from a water company. Some you'll have to apply from. Water, you normally have to pay a little bit for to get existing service records. But this starts to set the context of your site. It starts to help you think, what have they got on site? Now, this one's a bit of a biggie. So as you can see already on here, the overview plan, lots of dotted lines with electricity sort of lines there, so the ETL. This is a UKPN document. So there we go, from UK Power Networks. And then these are some of the asset plans. Drives down some of the detail, you'll see that where some of the apparatus is coming in, some of the local networks, some of the sort of the high voltage, some of the low voltage. Apologies, that should be coming through now. So you can see on all of these ones here where you've got some sort of low voltage. Sorry, is that coming through? Can we see that on our side? Chris, is that okay?
Yeah,
good.
all looks good.
Fine. And through this, you're starting to build a picture. So there's go through these, so many here. But it just gives you a plan. Now, some of these, if it's a smaller site, clearly you're just going to get one plan with a lot of the assets on it. This one's obviously, quite a significant site, so you've got plenty of the assets here. So you've got a big tower line here. This one is actually a 33,000 volts, so it's high voltage. And then we also have also another line here. This one's actually 132,000 volts, but it also shows all the other high voltage up to 11,000 volts. 11,000 volts will be part of where you might be able to connect into. 11,000 volts needs to be stepped down in terms of getting to the low voltage. But again, something just to be, really aware of. So that Line Search Before You Dig, really helpful, sets a scene. You've got an idea of where things are. Knowing where things are, got twofold. One, there could be a constraint on your site. So that's something you've got to deal with. You've either cross it, got to move it, what are the costs involved and all of that. And that's worth asking. You can go straight to the operator to ask them those things. And then the other bit is, hold on, I've got 5, 10 plots, 1,000, depending on where you are in terms of your range and what type of sort of development you're involved in. And you make that budget application, make it as soon as possible, because you need to understand what capacity is there. When that information comes back to you, a lot of the information runs in 2 bits, contestable and non-contestable. Contestable is stuff that you can do, ideally with an independent type operator. So you can either do an ICP, which is an independent connections provider, someone going to lay that equipment. Water has a slightly different system. They're called NAVs, which are that was a stand for. It stands for new appointments and variations. Sorry, slight brain fog there for a second. And what they do is they can do those works on your behalf. So that's the contestable. Non-contestable is pretty much run by the big spine of operators that we already have. People like Thames Water, people like UK Power Networks. They own that network, so it's only really they can operate on their own network. The bit in between, you can often go and do that, and that actually can be a significant saving as well. So yeah, from our perspective, you go and find out what is there first. Second, you can then start to look to make applications, and you make those budget applications, what we say, as soon as possible. That way, you know what costs, what is there and what you hopefully will be able to sort of build, or what timelines you might be under. The huge thing that we really find at the moment is time. The time to delivery, especially if that network needs any sort of reinforcement. If it needs some reinforcement, you could be trapped into a bit of a scenario where you just cannot deliver what you need to deliver, or you've got to think of alternative solutions to try and figure a way out
I actually
of
saw
delivery.
just on that, Ben, I actually saw something in the FT saying that we've actually got some of the longest queues, grid queues in Europe. So it is a real problem, and a lot of our connections are, you know, you're looking into 2030 for some of our sites that we're looking at, which obviously can cause a real impact on what the developers are trying to develop, and obviously their cash flow and deliverability.
And we couldn't stress it enough. You know, this is everyone tells you to do your due diligence. Everyone tells you to make sure you do things up front. You absolutely do. Don't go and buy something and not have done a couple of these critical things. You're just really not helping yourself understand exactly where you need to be at, what you need to do. So yeah, very much for electricity. Clearly, lots of things that have changed with electricity in terms of things like EV and that sort of future home standard that's going to be coming into play, and also the mandate for the government, which they're offering lots of incentives, by the way. So there's lots of opportunities to get into this in terms of incentives for heat pumps, incentives for PV, solar PV in terms of heating, and also solar electric as well. So in terms of things like small battery packs and units in terms of homes as well. So plenty out there to have a go at, and do look around for that. There's lots of opportunities. So that sort of house we look at when we're making applications, that it can range depending on the type of house, obviously the size wise, depending on how many people are in there, and also depending on, yes, it's got the EV included. So we run between about 2.2 to 3.3 in terms of kilowatts per house. It's like we use that as average. So we tend to go on the slightly higher side of things, just to make sure we're encapsulating everything for developers. And then if we realise that's causing problems in terms of the cost or reinforcement, then we've got flexibility to bring it down. Chris, I think I saw a question just pop up there as well. What was that?
So Anton Linton has posted, are developers aware that ICPs can help expedite delivery and shorten connection times?
Yeah,
Sorry, Louise.
Yeah, just jumping on that. Yeah, we do deal with quite a lot of the multi-utility companies when we're going out to get the points of connections. We will also run that in parallel with going out to a number of the multi-utilities. We've either got our own ones that we deal with, or depending on where our clients are in the country, we'll also go out to ones that they've used before. So there is quite a sort of a synergy between ourselves and the multi-utility companies to sort of work together on behalf of the client to see what's the best sort of package that we can put together as a whole team.
There's a few of them out there, aren't there, Louise? I mean, some are definitely better than others.
Yeah.
Some will tell you, as any salesperson would do, that they can deliver and it's not a problem. They can reduce the timescales, and then they can't. So it being mindful, and I think one thing that we want to be, and it's a really good stage, and I really appreciate that question actually, and please throw them in, and we will just stop dead and just go through them. It's because the reality sometimes of these new connections is, and why stressing early to understand where some of these assets already are and they exist, and why you get this point connections, is because where is the point connection from? Is this on a third party land? So, if there is, what you can see, a high voltage line, normally something like an 11 kV, and it might have a transformer on it, which is the same as effectively a substation. That's called a pad mounted transformer, which is effectively a substation floating in the sky rather than being on the ground. Is that your point of connection might be from that point. That point is on a third party land, not connected to your land. So how do you get that physical wire or physical connection, that could be from water, anything else, onto your land? ICPs can absolutely help in terms of actually making that connection. But where the stumbling blocks are is when that third party landowner says no. They turn around and say no. Now you have a right to get connected, but what not all ICPs have are the statutory ability to actually force that connection over that third party land. Whereas the network operator, so your UKPNs, your National Grid Electricity Distribution, your Northern Power Grids, they actually have the powers to actually make that connection over that land. So ICP will say it can be cheaper, but that negotiation still needs to happen. Now, ICPs on the whole are cheaper. And what Louise said, and because it's a competitive market, because that's how the industry is driven, it is absolutely imperative that you also go to them as well to go and get those quotes and understand that. But please be aware that do your diligence when someone says got connection from over a point over there, and you realise that that piece of equipment needs to get across somebody else's land. That's when your alarm bells need to be going, to be making sure that either yourself or whoever is engaged is actually making sure speaking proactively to that landowner. And it's a really key point on all connections. You know, you might see it, look at the plan, where does it go? If it's in the central road, okay, you know what, you're in a much safer position because your land boundary is alongside that road, that point of connection, which is a highway, highways which people can undertake works within those highways.
So what is an ICP? What does it mean?
So it's independent connections provider.
Right.
So they are a certified company which can undertake the works that can connect into what would be the grid. We're talking about electricity, but it's obviously the same is relative for the others, but they're just all given slightly different names, that can connect into the grid network. So what they do is they form the sort of conduit between where that point of where the electricity is into your site here. Now, the actual electricity company could do that, but they are more expensive, you know, from everything from the contract work, from the way their procurement works and all the rest of it. Because a lot of times they're procuring somebody else to do it, they're procuring contractor. So what the ICP is, they just sit as that contractor and they deliver those works. And of course, what they can do is because of their an accredited ICP, they can have the proper sensible chats with the electricity company, and they allow it to happen because it's a regulated business, so you don't need things going or exploding. I mean, clearly that's not great, is it? So yeah, that's what they are. There's also another one that sits in between those ones, and there's quite a lot of these big behemoths coming out now, and they're called IDNOs, and they're independent distribution network operators. So they sit aside from our kind of like when all our system got all denationalised, effectively, or privatised effectively. They sit as independent networks, but they've got a big name because they've got all the statutory powers as well. And they can come in and they're providing big networks for all the big house builders. So the likes of names of people like GTC is a really big name in the industry. They provide what is a holistic solution on all parts of all connections, water, gas, electric, telecoms, and they put all the network in, and then they just plug it into the grid from the edge, and they just service the whole lot. Yeah, so I think from our perspective, it's really important to get these budget quotes in, understand it. The budget quote can then move on to a formal quote. Clearly, when you've got a formal quote, you need to be getting control of that land. There needs to be the legal contract of sale that you've done, perhaps exchanged or somewhere in between, and then you can then move forward because then you're in a position to be able to potentially accept that quote, of which quotes have about 3 months. 3 months, isn't it, Louise, generally across the board for all of these ones? Yeah. And I think as well with your new connections, and this part of this due diligence element that I sort of talk about is, we talked about third-party land. I think I was going to also just talk about something like water as well, which is a really critical one as well, because wires and gas pipes can kind of go up and down relatively easy. They're all laid at sort of similar depths, but they're kind of going up or down, doesn't hugely affect them. Sometimes a little bit, but not too much. Something like water coming on, a mains connection, fine, but your connection going out, in terms of your foul and your drainage, it's really, really important to get to grips with exactly where your outfall is. If your topography runs down to the back of your site, for example, then you could have difficulties in terms of getting into that main central sort of foul that might be in the road. So even though you can see it on a plan and you think, great, the connection is there, just be mindful that if all your outflow for your properties, because the slope basically just goes away from you, goes to the back of the site, you're going to have to get it back up unless there's another way of doing it. And that's a significant cost. You're either going to have to pump it back up, or you're going to find some other very inventive solution. But in terms of your foul, you might not have any other option unless it's a septic tank you could potentially put in, depending if you 1 or 2 units, which obviously happens with a lot of barn conversions, for example. Or alternatively, you're trying to find, a way of limiting that sort of cost or that implication of trying to get back into that mains network in the road, or wherever your nearest one might be, and that can be very, very costly. And just a very simple, exercise of just understanding what the depth of it is in the road, and you can get that from the operators. So, and a lot of these things clearly can be on your site. So a lot of the stuff I've been talking about in terms of points of connection have been off-site. And that's where your appliance operators, clearly, if you've got apparatus which is on your site, you have opportunities to connect into those, but there can also be a constraint as well. And that's something that you just got to try and make sure you're keeping sort of very aware of as well. So I don't know if there's some other bits, Louise, if you sort of want to sort of chip and add maybe some couple of examples that we've been involved in recently, some of the things you're picking up.
Yeah, so as Ben said, we are dealing with quite a lot of developments at the moment where we are struggling to get those connection dates. So we've actually made the application and we're getting the connection dates back for 2028 up to 2032 at the minute. And what we just really advise is sort of the route to try and, I mean, there's only obviously a certain amount what the grid can do, but it's keeping that liaison and communication with the engineers that you're speaking to with regards to the applications that you're making, so that you keep that sort of relationship going, so that they know it's not a zombie scheme, it's not, as they call them. Previously, I know the government are now looking to change this, and new legislation came in at the start of this year to stop that, because the grid were just becoming overwhelmed with the amount of site applications that were coming in, which actually were called zombie schemes because they were never actually going to go ahead, or that they were just too early on in the process. They were then taking up places within the queue, and that's obviously had a huge knock-on effect for those schemes that actually will be coming forward. So that's a good thing that the government are doing, and hopefully that will just continue to see that queue management, as it were, making sure that that these timescales are being reduced. But at the end of the day, we haven't got the system in place in terms of the reinforcement that is required to make sure that we have these connection dates that are sooner than the timescales. Ways.
Absolutely. And Chris, sorry, just there was a sort of just a half frozen screen for a second. So Chris, from your point of view, in terms of your some of your network and people coming in, are people sort of brought up sort of the the implication of your connections? I think on your last talk, was it John, I think was sort of half mentioned something this as well.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that massively gets overlooked from developers, and this is what John was echoing on our webinar last week. Basically, John, if you don't know John Howard, he's the star of Property Elevator, which is a show that is like Dragon's Den, that invests in sort of people's properties and property developments. And John has been in the industry for over 30 years and built some huge developments. He built the wine rack on Ipswich Harbour, and he said when we announced that we were doing this webinar that it's such an important topic because it's the make or break between a development actually working or not. And it's one thing that we just assume is always there. We always assume that there's going to be sewage, there's going to be water, there's going to be electricity, gas not so much now as we're moving away from it. But then when you get on site and then actually start digging for the power lines or start trying to find them, even the right amount of headroom in the local substation or the right amount of capacity coming to that site is just not enough. So I think it's something that developers probably need to look at right before even the planning stage, to identify what they're going to need on site.
That's a really good point. And this is the idea. But when you go and look to appoint an architect, you appoint, your planners, you appoint, maybe you might even have your builder in for a bit of cost of works. A lot of them will give you a quote. They'll give you a bit of a freebie, potentially even just look a speculative up front. I mean, probably less architects and planners because you're going to start paying them, but a builder will give you potentially a quote. We can do that with some of the ICPs, as mentioned earlier on before. So you can get them to have a look at for you, because obviously they want to win the work. So it would be great, for anyone on this call, if anyone's thinking about it, is that, go and speak to them. Go and have a word, because they might give you that sort of inkling, that nudge to say, oh, this is going to be tricky. And that gives you the heads up. And I think you're absolutely right. In the past, it has been a bit of a given, and it still in lots of cases is. So it's not to scare people, but I want to just throw out a couple of things which is quite interesting, just off the back of that. And this is completely sidetracked, is the amount of debt water companies at the moment are in. So Thames Water currently sits at 15 billion in debt. United Utilities, 9 billion in debt. Severn Trent Water, 7 billion in debt. Anglian, 6.6. Yorkshire, 6. These are big, big numbers, which are a big issue in the industry, where these have just been racking up. And the timescales and the delivery that these guys are now having in terms of actually the reinforcement network is becoming complicated. They're being hit by government, as they rightly should be, for all the things and the dirty things they've been doing to try and cut costs and actually being negligent, whilst also not really reinforcing and updating their own networks. So it's just be mindful that even sometimes the simple connections, is the resourcing and the people in behind some of these are getting harder and harder. So getting in early saves you that opportunity, gets the dialogue moving along. You can get past the computer because you can get somebody appointed. And then it means you're not getting these delays in terms of you actually delivering your development. I mean, there's nothing worse if you've already been hit by planning delays and everything else, and you're trying to get on site to then only find out you're being delayed again when you're on site. It's nonsense. When the thing should be fairly obvious, it's there, it's in the road, or it's there, it's across the road. There's the opportunity to connect into it. So yeah, I think I echo, John's thoughts. Of course I would do. We're on the business, but we're into providing, making people are doing this themselves. And that's what we're key about doing. It's just doing that due diligence and just thinking you're not going to get caught out, because I don't want anyone to be caught out, and there should be no reason to be.
And you guys have a rule in the office as well, that you don't take the first 10 no's as a no, do you? You consistently.
Yeah. It sounds a bit strange, doesn't it? As well, we're definitely a bit of a. I mean, you know what, it's a good shout, that one is. But I'll put some context on it as well, because it might sound a bit strange in the office, and I'm sure HR might be having a word for some reasons for me trying to do that and pushing colleagues to do things. So the reality behind that, and exactly what I said to Chris, is that in terms of these companies, you sometimes feel that the answer they give you should be the correct answer. I had an interesting case recently. I won't sort of name names because I haven't been asked, that I can obviously share their information, but it was with a big commercial. They're into regeneration sort of type projects effectively, and they do big numbers of units all across West Midlands and far beyond as well. And they had a scenario where the water company effectively turned around and said, and it was Thames Water, I don't mind calling them out. I think it's really difficult for Thames Water at the moment, and I feel for them, but really said, oh, look, we don't think we've got the capacity for what you've got here in terms of what you're sort of developing. And I didn't understand, so I had to ask the question. The simple question was why? And they just said, because we don't. And so then I thought, well, why don't you? And then they couldn't explain why. But they couldn't. So I was probably about the second or third time now saying, I still don't get it. You've still not actually managed to explain to me why you don't have the capacity. So then we started including more people in the email. I did elevate it with different people in the organisation as well, but principally going to the same person. And by about the 7th time of pushing and just saying, well, look, it's tough, water company. We're just going to build them anyway. We're actually going to ignore the fact that you're saying that you can't connect, because we believe you have a legal duty to connect us, and you have a legal duty to actually reinforce your network and actually deliver the system. Next email I received was, oh, yes, no, we can now deliver the 200 units. I was like, are you having a laugh? I said, I have been, and my client has been down a route with you saying that you couldn't. And now all of a sudden you can, and it's not just an insurmountable amount. Oh, sorry, just below 200. It was 185. Sorry, yeah, it was 185 units. We were pushing for more. We were pushing for like 230, I think it was. And they came back with that number, and I was like, it's like throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded. I said, you know, I've just kept on doing it, and eventually I've hit the bullseye. And actually, without any real true explanation, it's the not taking a no for an answer. You know, he isn't going to fix everything. Clearly doesn't. But yeah, the 1 in 10 principle that I say with Chris is like, keep having a go. It is really worth it. You find out some, you know, interesting information by pushing. And I'm sure everyone's fairly familiar on this call, you know, on this webinar about that as well. You really have got to keep pushing. Yeah, so very much, Chris. I mean, I think that didn't that work as well when we did our Land Aid sleep out, and I asked you a few times if I could get warm with you, or was it the other way around? I think you were getting cold, weren't you? And I think then after about the 10th time of asking you, I said, "Yeah, fine, you can warm, you can come closer to me." So
I actually remember sleeping in the other part at the end towards with you persisting with the questions throughout the night. But yeah, so quickly moving on, Louise, in terms of sort of developers and their main issues, is that something that Ben's massively hit the nail on the head there? Is that something that you guys find is a regular problem when you're working with developers, is that they just don't know how to deal with those utilities companies or those service providers? Is that sort of the common issue that you run into when working with them?
Yeah, it is. And the other issue is that it's time consuming as well. So it's time consuming for the developer. So it's something that if they can sort of package it over to the likes of ourselves, we can sort of do all the due diligence for them, make all the calls, get all those relationships going, so that we can then say, this is where we're at with it. And we tend
we've gone so far, Louise, is actually offering prizes for being ignored in our office, haven't we? So I think Chris Skinner is like, you have to be persistent, don't you?
Yeah.
So we almost say to people, look, if you are ignored this many times, you almost win a prize. Because, and I know this is a flippant, and I'm sorry, I've turned it slightly, but for everyone on the call, but because it is frustrating, and it's frustrating when we have a system that legally should connect you, of which they have to connect you, and trying to get to the answer, and through persistence and not having SMEs beaten down by, you know, that sort of process. And I think it's also really hard for the utility companies. They've got mountains of paper that they've got to get through as well. So anything you can do to send to them to help them, you have to not just belligerently just chase. You have to chase with knowledge and be sympathetic to them. You know, we don't think, oh gosh, someone's not called us back after the 5th time of chasing. We're polite and persistent with them, but you don't need to be frustrated with them. They don't need to hear that. That's going to get you achieving absolutely nothing. So, you know, our advice with this is, you know, be kind, be persistent, be polite. You know, they have a lot on their plate. They won't mind dealing with you if you're chasing them, but you're chasing them in a meaningful and, you know, and good manner. And I think that's really, really key as well. People lose sight of that. They just get angry for the sake of it. And I think that doesn't build the relationship for the next site you're dealing with and that individual as well, which I think is really key.
You showed some slides at the start, Ben, in terms of the UK PA and sort of, you know, websites where you can detect whether there's lines drawn on them, that kind of thing. Is there any tips that you can give to a developer? Is there sort of any obvious signs when you're out on site that a site might have utilities connected, or is there any sort of signs that a site is going to be completely barren of any utilities? Is there any sort of giveaways when you're out there that would sort of indicate that, or is it you've got to do the due diligence beforehand?
Yeah, probably bit of both. So there are some signs that you can see. I mean, unsurprisingly, with electricity, it's fairly obvious. There is normally some sort of wire or a pole or some physical bit of equipment that you're sort of seeing. When you go into sort of something like telecoms, there's lots of is in the road, so it's not so bad. And again, it can be wire related, so you might see something overhead as well. Now we're moving into pipelines. When you're talking about gas and you're talking about water, there's two elements really. Gas, I would generally say, have been pretty diligent in the past about covering their rights from a legal perspective. So when you've looked at the title, the land title, land registry, there should be some reference to some of that equipment. Funny enough, it might not even mention the electricity, but that's another sort of conversation. But actually, with gas, there should be some sort of agreement that says, landowner with gas company agree for pipe to be laid, and I was laid there. Water is the problem. Water, can be often no obvious signs. I'll be honest, if you have got an obvious sign there's water on it, and there's, yes, clearly got things like manholes and you've got other things like that, these actual physical sort of features, then do take care to have a look. If there is any form of manhole, any sort of covering, get someone to lift it. There's been some horrific stories where people have ended up with massive chambers underneath the site, sterilising half their site. So, do that, walk the site. You've got to, have a look. The thing with water, though, is that's why absolutely essential to get records. The records might not even, and this is what happens because they're so historic, and when they were laid, when the person was laying it, they might not have laid it exactly where even the records are. I mean, it's madness to think that, but we've had that case. So at least if you've had the record, there's something there. And then the next thing is then to sort of interrogate it and just check it feels right with where it is. That might be something like you might be doing a sort of a scan effectively and go and actually commission what is just a surface scan, effectively a radar detection over the whole site. And someone will find out if there's any pipe there, and that's actually a really good way of just your due diligence, really, of doing one of those sort of scans over the site. So they're readily available, not that expensive to do, but we'll just find out if there are any sort of subterranean sort of features that might be sort of jumping at you. But yeah, long-winded answer to your question. It's a bit of both. We all know we should always walk a site and always look at it and look for things and telltale signs and things. And some of it might be vegetation orientated. So sometimes you can see quite clearly there's no trees or vegetation where ordinarily there should be. So there's a gap effectively between two bits of tree vegetation, and there's a clear through sort of gap, and you think, why is that being cut? Why is there nothing there? And that might mean there's a pipeline or even a wire underneath there, and someone's coming on there. But yeah, on the whole, we do say whatever you do it, you do your legal search, which will come up through a few results. You do your own searches on top of that, and then the final thing is to go and have a scan of the site. If you're not sure, especially if a water record comes back and says there is something there, then you're like, right, just do it. Find out, locate it where it is, because that could be a difference between one or two. You might have had 5 plots, but that could be the difference of losing 2 because your foundations are too close to that water pipeline, and you've suddenly got planning for something. It's not going to work.
So you're not out on site with your dowsing rods, then, sort of trying to detect water?
That's for somebody else for sure. But we could do. I mean, I'd like to see you do it. In fairness, it'd be good. But not quite. But that physical assessment is really good, like you've said. Looking at the perimeters of the site, making sure you're really properly walking the site, and just ask someone next door. I mean, but it's a long forgotten world of actually just door knocking or speaking to somebody you might just might be sort of local. They'll very quickly give you what their thoughts are on something. I mean, carefully, if you're perhaps sometimes a developer, that might not be the thoughts you want. But it's just critical in terms of this, in terms of looking at these things. I think what's interesting is just generally where things are sort of just going as well. So we say there's a huge pressure on electricity, and there is. There's mass amounts in terms of this. But as we turn off fuel, weirdly, that releases more electricity. I think I was reading the other day that actually, for every gallon of fuel production, it creates, I think we use something like 4 kilowatts for every gallon of petrol sort of fuel sort of production. So with that, what happens by reducing the amount of cars across the country and reducing the amount of reliance on fossil fuels, actually to refine those elements, we were having to use a lot of electricity. So actually, there's electricity saving back in the grid that then is now benefiting the things like EV, because people are worried about, like, oh gosh, we've got this massive influx of EV. How are we going to provide the supply? National Grid are clearly saying, well, actually, there's a net balance difference here. We're reducing carbon emissions, which is fantastic, but we are, by not refining, which requires a huge amount of electricity to refine anything, we are actually creating a more supply, more generation, effectively releasing of that generation for the rest of the country, which I think was really interesting to hear. I hadn't appreciated that. I thought it was all against one side. Also, the efficiencies in terms of what APC is bringing through. So things like LED lighting. I know we've talked about in terms of changing light bulbs, but that can be up to 50% more efficient. I think we just looked at our office recently. We're going to change things, and it's about a 65% saving if we change all to LED, and that obviously comes off our costs as well. But then that's a huge difference in terms of the energy efficiencies in our industry. So with the huge increases of wind, the battery storage in terms of actually providing balancing power, which is really, really important to our network of making sure that we can store electricity on the times that we're not using it, in non-peak demands, means we can reuse that sort of storage for when it's peaking demand. So we're in a bit of a limbo, and this is where there's complications and why we're pushing very hard on new connections and making sure people are sorting themselves out. But the sort of the attitude and the things going forward is really sort of positive. I think wind's targeting about 50 gigawatts of power by 2030. We've got a really good interconnectors over to kind of to Europe and across that way in terms of how we're sort of buying and selling electricity. So yeah, it's really good. But we just are saying at the moment we are in limbo. You've really got to make sure you're driving these new connections and really get on top of the timescales and things, because we are in a tricky place at the moment, and that's why we really suggest to go out to companies, go out to multi-utility companies, go out to utility companies, and go and get that advice. I think it's really, really important. I think I just saw someone pop up there, and I think it's great. Go to people who can give you utility advice. I think it's really, really important.
Great. And before we wrap up, Louise, have you got any sort of final thoughts or sort of advice you want to share with the audience?
I think just the key takeaways from me, which pretty much Ben has Ben has discussed, is it's that early engagement. It's communication and building those relationships with the various DNOs, gas companies and those sorts of things, just to make sure that you're at the forefront really in terms of getting that information and building that relationship. Great. It's also contesting things as well, challenging. So it could be that don't just always accept their first answer, would also be another takeaway for me. You can challenge them on the information that they provide you, and if it's done in the correct way, they don't see that as an issue. We had one recently where we had £3 million worth of upgrade costs, and the route to provide the connection was extensive in terms of the mileage that it was covering. So we started to look around and see if there was any other hotspots that we could say, well, actually, if you thought about going this way, to get you. So there is always those opportunities. Don't feel that you have to accept their first answer, would be another takeaway for me.
Great stuff. Well, I hope everyone will join me in thanking our two guests today, Louise and Ben. I've put the link in for BTS Property Consultancy in the chat, so if you want to click that, you can also find Ben in UK Homes Network. But guys, how can they reach out to you? How can they get in touch with you?
Through the UK Homes Network, you've hit the nail on the head there, Chris. If people wanted something, or they wanted a bit of a direction, I think the government are creating a portal for all utilities. So I think they're trying to go one step higher. I think there's obviously quite a few land portals out there that effectively deal with geo-referencing and things, but it's interesting the government are really onto this as well, so we all know exactly where equipment is. But yeah, the UK Homes Network, please message us through that. We can post it on there, post it for everyone's benefit as well, which I think is really key and important as well. So if anyone's got questions, thought, I didn't quite catch that, Ben and or Louise, just we can throw those in there.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks guys, really appreciate it. Fantastic session, a tour de force again of utilities and service connections. I'm sure we'll be back in the new year to discuss it even further. Yeah, so guys, if you haven't already, sign up to UK Homes Network. You can search it, UK Homes Network, in the app stores. Or alternatively, you can go to our website, ukhomesnetwork.com, and sign up via your web browser. Ben and Louise will be in there after this, so you can follow up with them with any questions you might have, or any sort of particular projects that you want to discuss that you're currently doing at the moment. We've got another webinar, as I say, next Friday. We're trying to do a webinar every Friday in the run up to Christmas. So if you want to keep up to date with those, you know where to find them in the app. Have a great afternoon, have a lovely weekend, and we'll catch you all very soon.
Thanks all.
Thanks very much all. Cheers.